In 1595, the Habsburgs and their Hungarian allies did something unthinkable. They laid siege to Esztergom and took it back from the Ottoman Empire. This was not a border skirmish, not a desperate stand. It was a deliberate attempt to reclaim a fortress that had guarded the Danube for more than 50 years. Esztergom was not just stone and walls. It was a locked gate to Central Europe, a symbol the Ottomans believed permanent. Its fall did not end the war, but it opened something far more dangerous. A belief that the war could be reversed. 43 years earlier, at Eger, Hungary proved it could survive. In 1595, at Esztergom, it proved it could strike back. This siege became the opening move of a coordinated Habsburg counteroffensive that would reshape the war between 1595 and 1598. And if you want to understand how empires begin to crack, not in one blow, but through moments like this, stay with this story. Because Esztergom was not the end. It was the beginning. If Esztergom was the beginning, then its roots lay deep in a collapse that Europe never truly recovered from.
In 1526, at Mohács, the medieval kingdom of Hungary was shattered in a single afternoon.
Its king was killed. Its army was destroyed. Its political center was erased. What followed was not occupation, but division. Central Hungary fell under Ottoman control. The west and north survived under Habsburg protection. The rest became a frontier of burned villages, shifting loyalties, and permanent war. When the Ottomans captured Esztergom in 1543, they did not simply seize a fortress. They secured the Danube corridor, the main artery linking the Balkans to the heart of Central Europe. From there, Ottoman power radiated outward. Buda fell. Székesfehérvár followed. Veszprém, one stronghold after another. The defense of Eger in 1552 interrupted this advance, but only briefly. Contemporary chronicles, later compiled by Hungarian historians, describe Eger as a moment of defiance, not reversal. The Ottomans remained dominant. Hungary remained broken. For decades, the balance barely shifted. But by the 1590s, the war entered a new phase. Historians call it the Long Turkish War, a conflict that drained both empires without delivering a decisive blow. Ottoman armies were now spread thin, fighting in the Balkans, in Transylvania, and along distant frontiers. Habsburg commanders, drawing on correspondence, scouting reports, and logistical records preserved in imperial archives, began to notice something rare: opportunity. Esztergom was still strong, but it was no longer central. The fortress that once anchored Ottoman control on the Danube had become a forward position. Isolated, overstretched, and vulnerable to a modern siege. History does not announce turning points. It waits for someone to recognize them. In 1595 at Esztergom, someone did. Recognizing an opportunity was only the first step. Turning it into victory required men, structure, and control. At the center of the Habsburg plan stood Archduke Matthias, a commander shaped less by battlefield legend than by organization and patience. This was not a feudal host gathered in haste. It was a composite army, assembled deliberately for siege warfare. The backbone of the Habsburg force was German and Austrian infantry. Disciplined, drilled, and accustomed to prolonged campaigns, these troops provided stability. They were not shock troops, but they held ground, protected artillery positions, and absorbed casualties without breaking formation. Supporting them was Hungarian heavy cavalry, armored nobles whose role was no longer frontal assault, but containment. They secured supply routes, screened the siege lines, and deterred Ottoman relief forces. Their presence was psychological as much as tactical, a reminder that the battlefield beyond the walls was no longer Ottoman territory. But the decisive arm of the army was neither infantry nor cavalry. It was artillery. Habsburg siege guns represented a generational leap. Heavier barrels, improved powder quality, greater accuracy. According to 16th century military manuals and later ballistic analysis, these cannons were designed not to intimidate, but to dismantle the stone systematically. Engineers measured angles, distances, weak points in the masonry. This was warfare governed by calculation. Inside Esztergom, the Ottoman garrison was experienced, not inferior. Many had served along the Hungarian frontier for years. They understood defense. They understood endurance. But they faced structural disadvantages. The garrison was relatively small, likely several thousand men. Sufficient for defense, but not for sustained counter-siege operations. Ottoman artillery within the fortress was lighter, optimized for an older defensive doctrine. It could harass attackers, but not silence siege guns beyond its effective range. Psychologically, the defenders were isolated. Ottoman field armies were deployed elsewhere, in Transylvania, the Balkans, and distant theaters of the Long Turkish War. No relief force could arrive quickly. At Eger in 1552, courage compensated for weakness. At Esztergom in 1595, courage alone was no longer enough. This was not a contest of bravery. It was a contest between systems. And for the first time in decades, Hungary entered the battlefield with one of its own. The Siege of Esztergom did not begin with panic. It began with order. At dawn, Habsburg artillery crews moved into position. Not rushing, not shouting, but measuring. Angles were calculated, distances confirmed. Guns were aligned towards sections of the wall that engineers had already identified as vulnerable. This was not intimidation fire. It was a demolition. When the first cannon spoke, the sound did not roll like thunder. It struck like a hammer, again and again and again. Ottoman defenders returned fire. From the walls, lighter guns barked back, scattering shot across the siege lines. Men fell. Earth burst upward. But the imbalance was clear. Ottoman artillery could harass. Habsburg artillery could destroy. Contemporary accounts describe days measured not in hours, but in breaches. Stone cracked. Mortar failed. Repairs were made at night, only to be undone by morning. This was siege warfare at its most unforgiving. No charge could break it. No courage could outlast it. Small Ottoman sorties struck the siege works. Desperate attempts to spike guns or disrupt supply lines. They were brave. They were costly. And they changed nothing. By the second week, the pattern was undeniable. Modern military historians, comparing Esztergom with earlier Ottoman fortresses, argue that this siege marks a shift from fortress warfare based on endurance. Fortress warfare is decided by sustained, industrial-scale firepower. Inside the fortress, the psychological strain deepened. The walls were still standing, but they no longer felt solid. Dust filled the air. Debris clogged streets. Every impact carried the same message. The wall would not hold. Ottoman commanders faced an impossible calculation. To remain meant slow annihilation. To sortie in force meant exposure to artillery and cavalry outside the walls. Relief was not coming. Ottoman field armies were committed elsewhere in the Long Turkish War, a fact confirmed by correspondence and later strategic analysis. Then came the moment all sieges moved toward. A section of the wall failed, not in a single explosion, but in collapse. Masonry weakened beyond tolerance gave way. Stones slid, timber snapped. The breach was not wide, but it was enough. Habsburg guns shifted fire. Infantry advanced to secure the opening. At this stage, sources diverge. Some Ottoman records suggest negotiations followed quickly. Habsburg accounts emphasize continued pressure and surrender under terms. What is agreed upon is this: Esztergom was lost, not stormed in fury, not betrayed from within. It was taken apart, piece by piece. This was not a defeat of soldiers. It was the defeat of a fortress designed for a world that no longer existed. The fall of Esztergom did not echo with celebration. It settled in silence. For the Habsburg commanders, this was not a triumph. It was confirmation. Proof that the Ottoman frontier was not immutable, that a fortress held for half a century could be taken, deliberately, methodically. Imperial correspondence written in the weeks after the siege speaks less of glory and more momentum. Confidence returned, cautiously at first, then steadily. Plans that once seemed unrealistic were revisited. Campaigns once postponed were reconsidered. From 1595 onward, the war changed character. Habsburg's strategy shifted from survival to pressure, from holding lines to test them. For the Ottoman side, the shock ran deeper. Esztergom had not fallen to a surprise attack or betrayal. It had fallen because it was dismantled under sustained fire. That distinction mattered. It raised an uncomfortable question within the Ottoman command structure. If Esztergom could fall, what else was vulnerable? Ottoman field armies remained powerful. Their resources are vast. But the sense of inevitability, the belief that Central Europe would always bend, was gone. Modern historians point to Esztergom as a psychological turning point. Not because it ended the Long Turkish War, but it altered expectations on both sides. The frontier did not collapse, but it cracked. And cracks, once formed, have a way of spreading. Eger, in 1552, proved that Hungary could endure, outnumbered, outgunned, yet unbroken. But endurance has limits. For decades after Eger, the frontier held, and nothing more. Esztergom, in 1595, marked the moment that changed the question. No longer can we survive? But how do we push back? This siege did not end the Long Turkish War. The fortress itself would change hands again. Empires did not collapse overnight. But history rarely turns on final victories. It turns on thresholds. At Esztergom, Central Europe crossed one. The lesson was not about walls, or cannons, or even numbers. It was about systems. Preparation replacing desperation. Coordination replacing improvisation. Pressure replacing hope. Modern historians see Esztergom as a signal. That early modern warfare had arrived on the Hungarian frontier. That courage alone was no longer decisive. That belief, once shaken, could not be restored easily. From Eger to Esztergom, the arc is clear. First, a nation learns how not to die. Then, it learns how to fight back. If this story matters to you, share it. Because history is not shaped by a single battle, but by the moments when people realize the rules have changed. And Esztergom was one of those moments.